Picture this. A man is drowning in the South Pacific, thrashing against a current that wasn't supposed to be there, while a camera crew on a replica 18th century sailing vessel watches in confusion because nobody called cut. The director isn't even on set. He quit 3 days ago. The star of the film, one of the most famous actors alive, is refusing to come out of his dressing room, and the studio back in Hollywood is hemorrhaging money at a rate that would bankrupt a small country. This isn't a disaster movie. This is the making of one. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's 1962 epic Mutiny on the Bounty was supposed to be the crown jewel of the studio system, a prestige picture that would remind the world why MGM was king. Instead, it became one of the most infamous production catastrophes in cinema history, a film that nearly destroyed careers, shattered friendships, and pushed a legendary studio to the brink of financial ruin. What audiences saw on screen was lush, gorgeous, and sweeping. What happened behind the camera was something else entirely. Let's pull back the curtain and uncover 15 dark secrets about Mutiny on the Bounty they never wanted you to know. Number 15. The script that wouldn't die. Before a single frame of film was exposed, Mutiny on the Bounty was already in crisis. The battlefield was the screenplay. MGM initially hired Eric Ambler, the renowned British thriller novelist, to craft a script that would distinguish this version from the beloved 1935 original starring Clark Gable and Charles Laughton. Ambler's approach was literary, layered, and psychologically complex. Treated Fletcher Christian not as a simple hero, but as a conflicted man, driven by conscience and ego in equal measure. The studio liked it, the director liked it, and then Marlon Brando read it. Brando had his own vision of Fletcher Christian, one that bore almost no resemblance to what Ambler had written. He wanted Christian to be an effete, foppish English aristocrat who undergoes a moral awakening. A dandy who finds his soul. This wasn't a minor character note. It was a wholesale reimagining that demanded a completely different screenplay. Brando began rewriting scenes himself, scribbling dialogue on napkins and hotel stationery, handing pages to bewildered crew members, and insisting they were improvement. Ambler, a proud and accomplished writer, found himself sidelined by an actor who believed he understood the story better than anyone. MGM, terrified of losing their star, brought in additional writers. Charles Lederer was hired to do a page-one rewrite. Borden Chase was brought in to punch up the action sequences. Then Ben Hecht, Hollywood's most legendary script doctor, was reportedly consulted. At one point, there were so many competing drafts circulating the production that actors would show up on set in the morning not knowing which version of a scene they were shooting. There was no finished scene at all, just a concept, a location, and Brando's insistence that he'd figure out the dialogue when the camera rolled. The script went through an estimated 5 complete rewrites and countless partial revisions were delivered to the set, still warm, from the mimeograph machine. Entire subplots were written, filmed, and then abandoned. The cost of this chaos wasn't just financial, though the wasted footage alone ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was psychological. Cast and crew members later described a pervasive sense of dread, the feeling that they were building a ship while already at sea. What should have been a foundation was quicksand, and they hadn't even left the harbor yet. Number 14. The director who walked into a trap. Sir Carol Reed was one of the most respected filmmakers in the world when MGM offered him Mutiny on the Bounty. He directed The Third Man, widely considered one of the greatest films ever made. He was knighted. He was meticulous, elegant, and quietly authoritative. He was also, as it turned out, exactly the wrong man for this. Reed arrived on the production expecting a challenging but manageable epic. What he walked into was a power vacuum that Marlon Brando had already filled. From the earliest days of pre-production, Reed discovered that his authority was theoretical. Brando had script approval, casting input, and the ear of the MGM executives who were bankrolling the picture. When Reed made a creative decision Brando disagreed with, the actor didn't argue. He simply went around him, calling producers directly or quietly, undermining the plan on set by improvising in directions Reed hadn't sanctioned. Reed, a gentleman of the old British school, was not equipped for this kind of guerrilla warfare. He directed through quiet suggestion and careful composition, not through force of personality. On a normal production, this approach produced masterpieces. It produced paralysis. Brando sensed weakness the way a predator senses injury. He began arriving later. He began requesting more takes, not because he was dissatisfied with his performance, but because he wanted to see what happened when he tried something different, and then different again, and again. Reed lasted only a few weeks of principal photography before the situation became untenable. The official story was that he departed due to creative differences, that genteel Hollywood euphemism that covers everything from mild disagreements to total warfare. The truth, according to multiple crew members who spoke about it years later, was starker. He was emotionally exhausted. He told a colleague that directing Brando was like trying to steer a ship that had its own opinions about the wind. He left the production quietly without public bitterness because that was the kind of man he was. Damage was done. Film had lost its captain, and the mutiny hadn't even been filmed yet. Number 13. Lewis Milestone's impossible assignment. The man MGM chose to replace Carol Reed was Lewis Milestone, a two-time Academy Award winner who had directed All Quiet on the Western Front and The Front Page. On paper, he was an inspired choice. A veteran filmmaker with the experience and the temperament to wrangle a runaway production back under control. In practice, he was being sent into a burning building with a garden hose. Milestone arrived in Tahiti to find a production that had already calcified around Brando's dominance. The crew had learned to wait for Brando. The other actors had learned to accommodate Brando. The producers had learned to appease Brando. Milestone, who had survived the trenches of early Hollywood and was not a man easily intimidated, attempted to reassert directorial authority. It was like trying to recork a bottle that had already exploded. The relationship between Milestone and Brando deteriorated almost immediately and then continued deteriorating for the remainder of the shoot. Milestone would set up a shot. Brando would question it. Milestone would explain his reasoning. Brando would suggest an alternative. Milestone refused. Brando would deliver his performance in a way that was technically competent but deliberately flat, forcing additional takes and burning through film stock in daylight. If Milestone capitulated, Brando would take that as confirmation that the director could be overruled and push harder the next time. Milestone, who was in his 60s during production, began to visibly age under the strain. Crew members recalled him sitting alone between setups, staring at the ocean with the hollow expression of a man who had stopped believing rescue was coming. He reportedly told a friend that this was the worst professional experience of his life. And this was a man who had directed pictures during the Great Depression, worked under the most tyrannical studio heads in history, and survived Hollywood's blacklist era. He finished the film. He had no choice. But those who knew him said he was never quite the same afterward. The sparkle was gone. The love of the craft had been beaten out of him on a tropical island most people would consider paradise. It looked like a dream location. For Lewis Milestone, it was a professional grave. Number 12. Brando's War of Attrition. To understand what Marlon Brando did to Mutiny on the Bounty, you have to understand that it wasn't sabotage, at least not in any conventional sense. Brando genuinely believed he was improving the film. He believed his instincts were superior to those of the screenwriters, the directors, and the studio. And the terrifying thing is, some of the time, he may have been right, but the cost of his genius, or his arrogance, depending on your perspective, was staggering. Brando's methods on Mutiny on the Bounty became legendary within the industry. He would demand dozens of takes of a single scene, not because he was struggling, but because he wanted to explore every conceivable approach. He'd rewrite his dialogue moments before cameras rolled, leaving his fellow actors scrambling to adjust. He'd disappear for hours, sometimes retreating to his rented house on Tahiti, sometimes simply vanishing into the island's interior, leaving an entire crew idle and the production's daily costs ticking upward like a taximeter in hell. One particularly notorious incident involved a dinner scene that should have taken a single day to shoot. Brando decided, mid-scene, that Fletcher Christian would eat differently than scripted. He began improvising with his food, picking at it, rearranging it, using it as a prop in ways nobody had anticipated. Scenes stretched from 1 day to 2, then 3. The cost of those extra days, crew salaries, equipment rental, catering, facility fees, was enormous. The final result, by most accounts, was not appreciably different from what could have been achieved in the original schedule, but confronting Brando was something nobody at MGM was willing to do. He was the biggest movie star in the world. He had been paid an unprecedented salary and given contractual powers that made him virtually untouchable. The studio had made a Faustian bargain. They got Brando's name on the marquee, but they surrendered control of their own production. Every day that Brando improvised, experimented, or simply refused to cooperate was a day that MGM couldn't get back and couldn't afford to lose. The total cost of Brando's creative process on this single film has been estimated at millions of dollars in overrun in 1960s money, a figure that's almost incomprehensible. It wasn't acting, it was a seed. Number 11, Richard Harris and the Simmering Fury. Richard Harris, the fiery Irish actor cast as Seaman John Mills, arrived on Mutiny on the Bounty, the ferocious energy and serious craft that would later make him an international star. What he found in Tahiti was a production in which one man's ego had swallowed everything, and it made him furious. Harris had enormous respect for the acting profession and an even more enormous temper. He watched Brando's delays, his rewrites, his refusal to hit marks or deliver consistent performances, and he seethed. Unlike the crew, who had to swallow their frustration to keep their jobs, this was a fellow actor with nothing to lose, and a constitution fueled by Irish whiskey and righteous indignation. He began making his feelings known, in private conversations with other cast members, then in increasingly loud and public complaints. Tension between Harris and Brando never erupted into a single dramatic confrontation, which in some ways made it worse. It was a sustained, grinding hostility that poisoned the atmosphere on set. Harris would deliver his scenes with blistering intensity, partly because he was a gifted actor, and partly because he was channeling genuine anger. He later said in interviews that working with Brando on this film was one of the most infuriating experiences of his career, and he used language considerably more colorful than infuriating. What made the situation particularly painful was that Harris admired Brando's talent, studied Brando's earlier work. He understood the man's genius. Genius without discipline, in Harris's view, was just self-indulgence, wearing a crown. He believed Brando was disrespecting everyone on the production, the director, the crew, the other actors, and the material itself, and he refused to pretend otherwise. Years later, Harris would speak about the experience with a mixture of bitterness and dark humor, describing the Tahitian shoot as a beautiful prison where talented people were held hostage by one man's whims. The anger never fully faded. It wasn't a rivalry. It was a slow burn that never found its outlet. Number 10, the Tahitian Money Pit. MGM chose to film Mutiny on the Bounty on location in Tahiti because they wanted authenticity. What they got was a financial abyss that nearly swallowed the studio whole. Tahiti in the early 1960s was not equipped to support a major Hollywood production. Infrastructure was minimal. Shipping equipment, sets, costumes, and supplies to a remote Pacific island was logistically nightmarish and catastrophically expensive. Every nail, every plank of lumber, every can of film stock had to be transported thousands of miles across open ocean. Something was forgotten or broken. On a production this chaotic, things were constantly forgotten or broken. The replacement had to make the same journey at the same cost with the same delays. Weather compounded everything. Tahiti's tropical climate meant unpredictable rain, blinding sun, and humidity that warped sets and destroyed equipment. Shooting schedules were built around weather forecasts that turned out to be fiction. Entire days were lost to sudden storms. Sets that had taken weeks to construct were damaged overnight. The replica of HMS Bounty, which had been built at enormous expense, required constant maintenance in the corrosive saltwater environment. Then there were the human costs. Crew members, many of whom had been told the Tahitian shoot would last a few months, found themselves stranded on the island for the better part of a year. Morale collapsed. Relationships back home frayed and broke. Some crew members developed health problems from the climate. Others simply gave up and went home, forcing the production to find replacements, who then had to be flown to Tahiti and brought up to speed at further expense. The original budget for Mutiny on the Bounty was approximately $8.5 million, already a substantial sum for the era. By the time the production finally left Tahiti, the costs had ballooned past $19 million, more than double the original estimate, and, at the time, one of the most expensive films ever made. For inflation, the overruns alone would be equivalent to well over $100 million today. MGM had wanted a tropical paradise. What they'd built was a monument to excess, and the bills would haunt the studio for years. Number 9. The Bounty replica and its hidden danger. The replica of HMS Bounty built for the film was, by any standard, a remarkable achievement. Constructed in Nova Scotia by the Smith and Rulin shipyard, the vessel was a full-scale, seaworthy reproduction of an 18th-century armed transport vessel. She was over 118 feet long, rigged with authentic period sails, and detailed with a craftsmanship that bordered on obsessive. She was also, as the cast and crew discovered, genuinely dangerous. The Bounty replica was built to look like an 18th-century ship, and in many respects, she handled like one. This meant she was slow to respond to the helm, prone to rolling in heavy swells, and equipped with rigging that could maim or kill the unwary. The actors, most of whom had no sailing experience whatsoever, were expected to climb ratlines, haul lines, and move across decks that were perpetually slick with salt water, all while wearing period costumes and leather-soled shoes that had approximately the same traction as oiled glass. Injuries were frequent and, in some cases, serious. Members suffered rope burns, falls, and cuts from the ship's hardware. Performers working the sailing sequences operated without many of the safety precautions that would be standard on a modern production. There were no safety nets beneath the rigging. The harnesses used for high work were rudimentary. When the ship was under sail in open water, the margin between a dramatic shot and a genuine emergency was terrifyingly thin. One incident that circulated among the crew for years involved a sequence in which extras were required to work the sails during a storm scene created by wind machines and water cannons. A combination of artificial wind, real ocean swells, and a deck awash in water created conditions that were functionally indistinguishable from an actual storm. Several extras were thrown from their positions. One man was carried below deck with injuries that required immediate medical attention. Medical attention that, on a ship in the middle of the Pacific, was limited to what the production's on-set medic could provide. The ship was beautiful. She was also a floating testament to the fact that authenticity and safety are often enemies. It looked like movie magic. It was pure survival. Number 8. Censors and Brando's Polynesian Romance. The Production Code Administration, the enforcement arm of the Hays Code that governed the moral content of American films, concerns about mutiny on the Bounty long before cameras rolled. The historical story involved mutiny against lawful authority, which was inherently problematic for censors who believed films should reinforce respect for the chain of command. The element that really set off alarm bells was the romance between Fletcher Christian and the Tahitian woman Mutiny, an interracial love story set in a tropical paradise depicted with physical intimacy and presented sympathetically. In 1962, the Hays Code was weakening but not yet dead, and interracial romance on screen remained one of its most sensitive pressure points. The censors reviewed the script with particular attention to the love scenes, flagging anything they considered excessively sensual or suggestive. They wanted the relationship sanitized, less physical, more restrained, safely within the bounds of what white American audiences in the early 60s would find comfortable. Brando, predictably, pushed in the opposite direction. He wanted the romance to feel real, to have heat and tenderness and the unmistakable weight of genuine desire. He was personally drawn to Polynesian culture and would, of course, marry his Tahitian co-star Tarita Teripaya, who played Mutiny. The connection between them was not manufactured for the camera, and Brando had no interest in diluting it to satisfy the anxieties of censors in suits back in Los Angeles. The result was a protracted negotiation between the production and the Production Code Administration, a back and forth over specific shots, specific lines of dialogue, and the precise degree of physical contact permissible between a white leading man and a Polynesian woman. Scenes were filmed in multiple versions, one for the censors, one for Brando's vision, with the understanding that the final cut would be determined by whoever blinked last. In the end, the film's romantic scenes were considerably tamer than what Brando had wanted, but more daring than what the censors had initially demanded. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody, which is, of course, the definition of most compromises. The love was real. The fight to show it was exhausting. Number 7. Trevor Howard's quiet professionalism and private torment. Trevor Howard, the distinguished British actor cast as Captain William Bligh, was in many ways the anti-Brando. Arrived on set prepared, knew his lines, hit his marks, and delivered consistently excellent performances with minimal fuss. Was, by every account, a consummate professional. He was also, by many of those same accounts, drinking heavily throughout the production. Howard's alcoholism was an open secret in the British film industry, and the conditions on Mutiny on the Bounty did nothing to help. The interminable delays, the script chaos, the suffocating humidity, and the sheer boredom of waiting for Brando to decide he was ready to work, all of it fed Howard's worst habit. He was never visibly impaired on camera because he was too skilled and too proud for that. But between setups, and especially in the evenings, Howard retreated into drink with a quiet determination that worried those around him. What made Howard's situation particularly cruel was that he was giving one of the finest performances of his career. Captain Bligh was not the one-dimensional tyrant of the 1935 version, but a complex, wounded, rigidly principled man whose cruelty stemmed from a desperate need for order in a world that refused to provide it. It was subtle, layered work, the kind of performance that requires complete control. Howard delivered it while his personal life was fraying, and his co-star was turning every scene into an unpredictable improvisation. Howard rarely complained publicly about Brando, but his frustration leaked through in small ways. A tightening of the jaw when Brando requested yet another take, a clipped tone in interviews when asked about his co-star's method. He was from a generation of actors who believed preparation was a form of respect, that knowing your lines and showing up on time was the bare minimum you owed your fellow performers. His approach violated everything Howard held sacred about the craft. He gave the performance of a lifetime surrounded by chaos, and he carried his private pain with the same quiet discipline he brought to every scene. The cameras saw brilliance. They didn't see the cost. Number 6. The original ending that was shot, scrapped, and shot again. The ending of Mutiny on the Bounty was rewritten and refilmed so many times that it became a running dark joke among the crew. The historical record offered several possible conclusions to Fletcher Christian's story: death on Pitcairn Island, possible survival under an assumed name, or a more ambiguous fate. And the production tried virtually all of them before settling on the version audiences ultimately saw. The original scripted ending, based on Eric Ambler's draft, depicted Christian's death on Pitcairn in a way that was morally complex and deliberately uncomfortable. Christian was to be shown as a man who had achieved freedom through mutiny, but found that freedom carried its own unbearable weight. It was dark, literary, and psychologically rich. Brando liked some elements of it. He hated others. He proposed alternatives. Writers scrambled. A second ending was written in which Christian survives and finds a kind of peace. This was filmed at considerable expense, with new sets constructed and additional location work required. When the footage was assembled, Brando decided it was wrong. The character wouldn't find peace, he argued. Christian was too damaged, too haunted by what he'd done. A third version was proposed. Arguments ensued. The final ending, in which Christian is fatally burned while trying to save the bounty from being torched by the mutineers, was itself a compromise that satisfied Brando only partially. He wanted the death to carry more philosophical weight. The studio wanted it to be dramatically clear and emotionally satisfying. The director, whichever director was in charge at that point, simply wanted it to be finished. The multiple endings consumed weeks of additional shooting time and cost the production hundreds of thousands of dollars. Footage from the abandoned versions was stored, and some of it may have been eventually destroyed as MGM struggled financially in the decades that followed. What remains is a testament to what happens when a film's conclusion becomes a hostage negotiation between an actor's artistic vision and a studio's desperate need to complete the picture. They filmed the ending 3 times. They were lucky they finished it at all. Number 5. The Insurance Nightmare. By the midpoint of production, Mutiny on the Bounty had become such a notorious disaster that it created genuine problems for MGM's insurance underwriters. Production's completion bond, the insurance policy that guarantees a film will actually be finished, was under unprecedented strain, and the conversations happening behind closed doors between the studio and its insurers were, by all accounts, deeply unpleasant. Completion bonds exist because filmmaking is inherently risky. Productions go over budget. Directors are fired. Stars get injured. The bond company steps in, covers the overruns, and ensures the film gets finished and delivered to theaters. But the bond structure is built around the assumption that overruns will be manageable. 10% over budget, perhaps 20 in extreme cases. The Bounty blew past those thresholds so quickly and so dramatically that the insurers found themselves in uncharted territory. There were serious discussions about shutting the production down entirely, simply cutting losses, writing off the tens of millions already spent, and walking away. The arithmetic was brutal. Every additional week of filming added hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost. The script still wasn't locked. The director's situation was unstable. The weather was unpredictable. And the star, the man around whom the entire production revolved, was contractually insulated from any consequences for his behavior. In the end, the calculation that kept the cameras rolling was a grim one. MGM had already spent so much that abandoning the film would have been an even bigger financial catastrophe than finishing it. The sunk cost fallacy, usually a logical error, became the production's actual survival strategy. The insurers renegotiated their terms. The studio tightened its belt elsewhere, slashing budgets on other productions to keep Mutiny on the Bounty alive. Other films that might have been made, stories that might have been told, were sacrificed on the altar of this single, monstrous production. Ripple effects were felt across MGM's entire slate for years. One film's excess became an entire studio's austerity. The studio covered it up, but the ledgers told the truth. Number 4. The cast and crew's tropical affliction. Paradise has a way of punishing those who overstay their welcome, and the cast and crew of Mutiny on the Bounty overstayed by months. The health consequences were significant, varied, and in some cases, lasting. Tahiti's tropical environment, so photogenic on screen, was an assault on bodies accustomed to the temperate climates of Los Angeles and London. The heat was relentless, not the dry heat of a California backlot, but a heavy, saturated humidity that soaked through clothing, warped wooden sets, and turned every physical task into an endurance test. Crew members working on the ship's deck or building sets in direct sunlight suffered heat exhaustion with alarming regularity. The production's medical team, which had been sized for a normal shoot, was overwhelmed. Tropical diseases and infections became a constant concern. Coral cuts, which were virtually unavoidable for anyone working in or near the water, had a nasty tendency to become infected in the warm, bacteria-rich environment. Several crew members developed severe skin infections. Gastrointestinal illnesses swept through the company in waves, probably caused by unfamiliar food, contaminated water sources, or both. At one point, a significant percentage of the crew was operating at reduced capacity due to illness. Insect-borne diseases were another hazard. The mosquito population in Tahiti was robust and enthusiastic, and despite preventive measures, bites were constant. The threat of dengue fever hung over the production like an invisible cloud. Whether any crew members actually contracted dengue during the shoot is not definitively documented, but the risk was real and the anxiety it produced was corrosive. Perhaps most insidiously, the extended stay took a psychological toll that manifested as physical symptoms. Insomnia, anxiety, depression, and what would today be recognized as burnout were widespread among crew members who had been separated from their families for far longer than anticipated. Some turned to alcohol. Others simply endured, grinding through each day with the numb determination of soldiers on a campaign that has gone on too long. They went to Paradise. Paradise tried to eat them alive. Number 3. The film that nearly killed MGM. The financial damage inflicted by Mutiny on the Bounty on Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was not merely severe, It was existential. The film's final cost, estimated at approximately $19 million, made it one of the most expensive productions in cinema history at that point. Combined with its disappointing box office performance, the film earned back only a fraction of its cost during its initial theatrical run. The loss was catastrophic. MGM, in the early 1960s, was already a studio in decline. The golden age of the studio system was ending. Television was siphoning audiences. The old moguls were dying or retiring. The company needed Mutiny on the Bounty to be a hit on the scale of Ben-Hur, the 1959 epic that had temporarily rescued the studio's finances. Instead, they got a critically mixed, commercially underperforming prestige picture that represented the single largest financial loss in MGM's history up to that point. The consequences cascaded through the studio for years. Planned productions were shelved, development deals were canceled, staff was laid off. The lot itself, the legendary MGM backlot in Culver City, once the most famous filmmaking facility in the world, began its long, slow decline toward the property sell-offs that would gut the studio in the 1970s. It would be an oversimplification to say that Mutiny on the Bounty alone killed MGM. But it would not be an oversimplification to say that it was the wound from which the studio never fully recovered. Number 2. Brando's accent and the performance. Nobody understood. When audiences first saw Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962, many of them had the same bewildered reaction. What was Marlon Brando doing with his voice? His Fletcher Christian spoke in a high, clipped, quasi-aristocratic English accent that sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard from Brando before, or for that matter, from any human being who had actually grown up in England. It was a creative choice that divided audiences, baffled critics, and became one of the most controversial acting decisions of the decade. Brando's reasoning was characteristically thoughtful and characteristically infuriating. He had decided that Fletcher Christian, as a man of the English upper class in the 18th century, would speak in a particular way, a way that reflected both his breeding and his psychological rigidity. The accent was meant to convey a man trapped inside the armor of his social class, a man whose very speech patterns were a kind of prison from which the experience of Tahiti would eventually liberate him. As the film progresses, Brando subtly loosened the accent, allowing Christian's voice to become warmer and more natural as the character shed his English identity. It was, in theory, a brilliant piece of character construction. In practice, it struck many viewers as absurd. Critics savaged it. Comedians parodied it. The accent became a punchline that obscured the genuine artistry underneath. Brando, who was hypersensitive to criticism despite his public posture of indifference, wounded by the reaction, though he never publicly admitted it and never apologized. Number 1. The real mutiny was behind the camera. Here's the darkest secret of Mutiny on the Bounty, and it is hiding in plain sight. The film is about a crew that rises up against an unreasonable authority figure, a man whose rigid control and contempt for those beneath him make rebellion inevitable. And that is exactly what happened during the making of the film itself. The roles were reversed, and the mutiny was never resolved. Marlon Brando was, in the eyes of the directors, the writers, the studio, and much of the crew, the tyrant of this production. Not Captain Bligh. Bligh at least had the virtue of knowing what he wanted and pursuing it with consistency. Brando was something more destabilizing, an authority figure who changed the rules daily, who exercised enormous power without accepting any of the responsibility that should have accompanied it. Controlled the script, the schedule, the performances of those around him, and the emotional temperature of every room he entered. And when the results were not to his liking, he blamed others. The crew's frustration was real and deep. These were working professionals, electricians, grips, camera operators, costumers, who depended on steady employment and could not afford to antagonize the most powerful man on set. They endured the delays. They endured the wasted days. They endured watching their colleagues get fired or sidelined for the sin of doing their jobs competently in a way that inconvenienced the star. Their mutiny was silent, expressed in bitter conversations in crew quarters, in the mechanical joylessness with which they eventually performed their duties, in the way they stopped caring about a film that clearly didn't care about them. The directors, both of them, experienced their own form of mutiny against the system that had placed them in an impossible position. Reed left. Milestone stayed, but surrendered. Neither man was able to captain the ship. The writers mutinied against coherence, producing draft after contradictory draft until the script was less a document than an archaeological site, layer upon layer of abandoned intentions. And MGM itself mutinied against its own financial interests, continuing to pour money into a production that every rational analysis said should be shut down, because the alternative, admitting failure, was psychologically unbearable for men who had built their careers on the illusion of control. The real mutiny on the Bounty was not Fletcher Christian's. It was everyone's. It was a production in which every single person involved eventually rebelled against the circumstances they found themselves in, and nobody won. That is the darkest secret. Not a single anecdote, but a truth that encompasses the entire catastrophic enterprise. It wasn't a film set. It was a ship with no captain, no map, and no shore in sight. Bonus fact: the lost footage that vanished. In the decades following the film's release, rumors persisted within Hollywood about a vast quantity of unused mutiny on the Bounty footage locked away in MGM's vaults, alternate takes, abandoned endings, deleted scenes, and complete sequences that had been filmed at enormous expense and then cut from the final picture. The estimates varied. Some sources claimed there were hundreds of thousands of feet of unused negative. Others put the number even higher. By some accounts, enough footage was shot to assemble multiple entirely different versions of the film. The fate of this material is one of Hollywood's quiet tragedies. As MGM's financial situation deteriorated through the 1960s and 70s, the studio's physical assets, including its film vaults, became casualties of corporate cost-cutting and corporate indifference. Properties were sold, archives were neglected, materials that had once been considered priceless were reclassified as storage expenses. Credible reports that significant quantities of unused footage from various MGM productions, potentially including Mutiny on the Bounty, were destroyed or allowed to deteriorate beyond salvage during this period. Might that footage have contained scenes from Eric Ambler's original script, Carol Reed's earliest directorial work on the film, Brando's countless improvised takes, the experimental performances that he insisted on exploring even as the production burned through money and time. The alternate endings, the ones that were written, argued over, filmed, and then discarded in the endless search for a conclusion that would satisfy everyone and ultimately satisfied no one. Some of this footage may still exist, buried in archives that have passed through multiple corporate hands as MGM's assets were bought, sold, and reorganized over the decades. Film preservation organizations have made heroic efforts to locate and restore lost materials from this era. But the reality is that much of what was shot for Mutiny on the Bounty is almost certainly gone forever, dissolved by time, chemistry, and the indifference of corporations that saw celluloid not as art, but as inventory. Somewhere in those lost frames is the complete story of what happened on that production. Every improvisation, every argument, every moment of brilliance, and every moment of madness, preserved in silver halide crystals on a strip of acetate. Or not preserved. Probably not preserved. The evidence was burned. But the legend survived. Mutiny on the Bounty should not exist. It survived 2 directors, an endless script crisis, a star who treated a $100 million production as his personal laboratory, a studio bleeding money from every pore, tropical illness, dangerous seas, and a level of on-set dysfunction that would have killed any lesser picture. And yet somehow, impossibly, the film that emerged from this wreckage is stunning. It is gorgeous to look at, powerfully acted, and anchored by a Brando performance that, for all its controversy, contains moments of genuine brilliance. The chaos produced something beautiful. It always costs more than it should. If you want the dark truth behind more Hollywood classics, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.